The judge slammed his gavel, issuing a fine to the defense attorney, only to realize moments later he had just penalized the Vice President of the United States. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settled in people's chests and refused to leave. The case had drawn national attention. A multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate, Titan Digital, stood accused of severe ethical violations. Allegations range from mass data privacy breaches to suppressing competition through illegal maneuvers. If found guilty, the ruling could set a precedent that would shake the corporate world to its core. Judge William Adler adjusted his glasses, scanning the packed courtroom. Before his eyes settled on the defense table, he had presided over enough higher-profile cases to recognize when an attorney was out of their depth. Yet the man standing there, a relatively unknown figure, carried himself with an unsettling level of confidence. No nervous tics, no fidgeting. Just a calm, measured expression as he straightened his suit jacket. The prosecutor, Linda Pruitt, was another story. A well-respected federal attorney, with a reputation for being ruthless. In the courtroom, she was known for dismantling defenses with surgical precision, and today she looked like a shark that had just smelled blood. Judge Adler tapped his gavel once. "Ms. Pruitt, you may proceed." She rose smoothly, making her way to the center of the room. "Your Honor, the facts of this case are undeniable. Titan Digital knowingly engage in unlawful data collection, harvesting personal information without consent, and then profited off that data by selling it to third parties. Evidence will show they manipulated algorithms to push out competitors, forcing small businesses to fold under the weight of an unfair marketplace. And most damning of all, internal memos proved they were aware of these actions, but chose to continue for profit." She turned slightly, casting a sharp glance toward the defense table. "And yet the defense is prepared to argue that these actions were not only legal, but ethical. I look forward to hearing that justification." Judge Adler looked at the defense attorney, who had yet to introduce himself formally in court. "Counselor, do you wish to respond before we proceed with witness testimony?" The man finally stood, buttoning his suit with deliberate ease. When he spoke, his voice was steady, controlled. "Your Honor, my name is John Vance, and I intend to show that the prosecution's case, while compelling, is built on misinterpretations in selective framing of the law." Judge Adler narrowed his eyes. There was something about the way the man spoke, the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that wasn't typical of defense lawyers facing down a federal prosecution. Ms. Pruitt let out a sharp exhale, shaking her head. "Your Honor, we're not here to entertain semantics. The evidence is overwhelming. I have expert witnesses prepared to testify on the direct impact of Titan Digital's misconduct. Their testimonies will confirm that these practices were both illegal and harmful." John Vance tilted his head slightly. "With all due respect, Ms. Pruitt, intent matters, application of the law matters. You can line up all the witnesses you want, but if Titan Digital operated within legal boundaries, even if you find their actions distasteful, that does not make them criminals." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Judge Adler raised his hand to silence them. "This is not the time for grandstanding. Mr. Vance, stick to the facts." John simply nodded, returning to his seat. But the tension in the room had shifted. Ever so slightly, something about this man was off. But for now the trial would proceed, and the judge would be watching closely. Linda Pruitt wasted no time. She strode confidently across the courtroom, signaling to the bailiff. The prosecution calls Dr. Thomas Baer to the stand. A man in his mid-50s, wearing a tailored suit and wire-rimmed glasses. Made his way up, he was a data ethics expert with years of experience analyzing corporate malfeasance. Once sworn in, Pruitt stepped forward. "Third Barrett, can you describe for the court what Titan Digital was doing with the user data?" He cleared his throat. "Yes. Titan Digital engage in a sophisticated form of user profiling. They collected vast amounts of personal data, search histories, location tracking, voice recordings, even private messages. In some instances without clear user consent. This data was then monetized, sold to third-party advertisers, and used to refine algorithms that controlled what users saw online. Essentially, they manipulated user behavior while maximizing profit." Pruitt nodded. "And to be clear, was this legal?" Baird hesitated, then chose his words carefully. "That's the debate under existing U.S. data privacy laws. There are gaps, loopholes that allow companies to justify these actions. But ethically, it's a violation of consumer trust." Linda Pruitt turned to the jury, letting the weight of those words settle. Then she pivoted back to the defense table. "Your witness, John Vance, rose from his seat and approached the stand with a measured pace, pausing just long enough to make Dr. Bear slightly uncomfortable to bear. You mentioned that Titan Digital's actions exploited loopholes in the law. Can you specify which laws they actually broke?" The Barrett adjusted his glasses. "While there isn't a single law that outright criminalizes this, regulations like the FTC Act prohibit unfair business practices." John cut in smoothly. "Unfair? Yes, but illegal." Dr. Barrett hesitated. "That's for the court to decide." John gave a small nod. "Exactly. And isn't it true that most major tech companies engage in some form of data collection?" Your bet shifted slightly. "Yes. But not all of them do it in deceptive ways." John took a step closer. "Titan Digital's user agreement, did it include language about data collection?" Dr. Bear sighed. "Yes. But no further questions." John turned and walked back to his seat, leaving the jury with an open-ended thought. If Titan Digital disclosed its data practices in their terms of service, could it really be considered illegal? Linda Pruitt's jaw tightened. She knew what he was doing. He wasn't fighting the case on morality. He was dismantling it on technicalities. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, former Titan Digital employee Sarah Levine." A woman in her early 40s walked up to the stand. Visibly uneasy, she took the oath, hands trembling slightly as she sat down. Pruitt softened her tone. "Miss Levine, can you tell the court about your role at Titan Digital?" "I worked in internal compliance," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "My job was to review company policies and ensure they aligned with legal requirements." "And did Titan Digital knowingly engage in unethical practices?" A pause, then a slow nod. "Yes. I saw emails from senior executives discussing how to adjust policies to avoid triggering regulatory scrutiny. There were entire teams dedicated to pushing boundaries without technically breaking laws." Put pressed on. "And did anyone within the company express concerns about these actions?" Sarah hesitated, then quieter. "I did." "And what happened when you did?" A deep breath. "I was let go." The courtroom fell silent. John Vance, however, showed no reaction. He simply stood and walked toward the witness stand, hands in his pockets. "Ms. Levin," he began, voice calm, "you mention internal discussions about adjusting policies. Did Titan Digital ever instruct employees to break the law?" Sarah shook her head. "Not directly. So as a compliance officer, did you ever formally report these concerns to federal agencies?" She hesitated. "No." John leaned forward slightly. So to summarize, you found their policies questionable but not illegal. You didn't report them, and now you're testifying against your former employer. Because you feel wronged. Sarah swallowed hard. It's not just about me. It's about what they did to millions of people. John held her gaze for a moment before stepping back. No further questions. Judge Adler adjusted his glasses again. His expression unreadable. But there was something about John Vance's approach that was starting to feel methodical. John Vance leaned back in his chair, watching as Linda Pruitt called her next witness. A cybersecurity analyst who had compiled a detailed report on Titan Digital's algorithms. The prosecution was methodical, painting a picture of a company that had buried its deceit under mountains of legal jargon. But John wasn't worried. In fact, he looked almost relaxed. Judge Adler noticed Mr. Vance. The judge said, adjusting his glasses, "Do you have any cross-examination?" John rose, buttoning his suit jacket with the liberties. "Just a few questions, Your Honor." He walked toward the witness stand, exuding a quiet confidence that was starting to feel unsettling. "You analyzed Titan Digital's algorithms, correct?" he asked the analyst. "Oh, hang on. Yes, and you determined that they were used to manipulate what users saw online?" "Yes. The algorithm was designed to favor Titan's own products and services while suppressing competitors." John nodded, pacing slightly. "Would you say that's unusual in the tech industry?" The analyst hesitated. "Well, no. Most major companies use algorithms to prioritize their own products. So in other words, Titan Digital was doing what nearly every other major company does. They took it further." John stopped pacing. "But they didn't break the law." A long silence followed. The analyst shifted slightly. "Not in a way that's been explicitly ruled illegal." John turned toward the jury. "Interesting." He paused, letting the word settle in the air. No further questions. Linda Pruitt was already on her feet. "Your Honor, the prosecution has provided overwhelming evidence that Titan Digital knowingly exploited legal gray areas to the detriment of consumers." John tilted his head slightly. "Gray areas?" He let the phrase hang in the air before turning toward the judge. "Your Honor, if the law does not explicitly prohibit an action, can a defendant be found guilty for violating it?" Judge Adler raised an eyebrow. "You're dangerously close to arguing semantics, Mr. Vance." John gave a half smile. "Perhaps. But semantics matter in a court of law, don't they?" Linda Pruitt exhaled sharply. "Your Honor, this is a diversion." "Is it?" John turned to the jury. "Titan Digital may have operated unethically, but unethical isn't the same as illegal. If the prosecution cannot point to a law that was definitively broken, then what are we really doing here?" A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Judge Adler banged his gavel. "Once enough. The jury will disregard any attempts to blur the lines of morality and legality." John smiled. "Of course, Your Honor. But the damage was done." He had planted the seed. Through its frustration was evident. She knew what he was doing. He wasn't trying to prove Titan Digital was innocent. He was proving that the law itself was insufficient to convict them. And worse, he was succeeding. But there was still time. The prosecution had one more angle to play. Linda Pruitt took a slow breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the prosecution table. She had seen slick defense attorneys before. But John Vance was in a different league. He didn't argue. He redirected. He didn't deny wrongdoing. He questioned whether the law had the authority to punish it. She couldn't let him control the narrative. The prosecution calls CEO Robert Landry to the stand. A tall silver-haired man in expensive suit made his way forward. Landry was the face of Titan Digital. Calm, polished, but with the wary look of someone who had spent too many years dodging scrutiny. Once sworn in, Pruitt wasted no time. Mr. Landry, Titan Digital is accused of exploiting user data, prioritizing profits over ethics, and deliberately suppressing competition. Do you deny any of these allegations? Landry clasped his hands in front of him. Titan Digital has always operated within the boundaries of the law. Pruitt smiled tightly. That's not what I asked. He exhaled slowly. I don't deny that. Our business model prioritizes growth and profitability. That's the nature of a competitive industry. Pruitt nodded as if expecting the answer. And how many times did your own internal teams warn you that your practices were ethically questionable? Landry shifted slightly. I don't have an exact number. So more than once, yes. And yet you continued. Landry's jaw clenched. We followed the law. Put turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, there it is, not a denial, not an excuse, just an insistence that technically no laws were broken. She turned back to Landry. Would you say Titan Digital was careful to avoid crossing legal lines? Yes, and would you also say that Titan Digital made a conscious effort to stay just inside those lines, even if it meant exploding loopholes? Landry hesitated for the briefest moment. Yes. Pruitt paused. No further questions. She turned and walked back to her table, resisting the urge to glance at John Vance. She had given him an opening, but a dangerous one if he wasn't careful. Pushing this argument further could reveal more than he intended. John stood buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. His tone was casual, conversational. Mr. Landry, you testified that Titan Digital followed the law. Correct? Yes. And would you say that the law exists to provide businesses with clear guidelines on what is and isn't permitted? Yes. So if Titan Digital operated within those guidelines, whose fault is it if the law wasn't strict enough? Linda Pruitt shot up. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Adler lifted a hand. Sustained. Mr. Vance, rephrase your question. John nodded unfazed. Mr. Landry, did any federal agency warn Titan Digital that it was violating the law before this case? No. Did the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, or any other regulatory body issue fines or cease and desist orders? No. John turned to the jury. Interesting. Pruitt was already on her feet again. Objection. The defense is trying to suggest that legality and morality are interchangeable. John shrugged. Isn't that exactly what the prosecution is doing? They've spent this entire trial trying to convince you that Titan Digital is guilty of something. But guilty of what? He let the question hang for a second before continuing. They want you to be angry. They want you to punish Titan Digital for playing by the rules, simply because they don't like the rules. Judge Adler sighed. Mr. Vance, you're getting dangerously close to lecturing the jury. John gave a small nod. Understood, Your Honor, but he had already done what he needed to. You final. The jury wasn't just thinking about Titan Digital anymore. They were questioning the very foundation of the case itself. Pruitt sat down, clenching her jaw. She had one last move to make. But first the judge had something to say. Judge William Adler exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the bench. He had seen his fair share of defense attorneys twisting arguments, playing to the jury's emotions. But John Vance was different. There was no arrogance, no dramatic gestures. Just a quiet, controlled confidence. That made it impossible to ignore him. And that bothered Adler more than he cared to admit. He straightened in his seat. Mr. Vance, while your arguments have been creative, I am warning you now, if you continue leading the jury into philosophical debates rather than focusing on the case, I will take action. John Vance didn't flinch. Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of straying from the facts. Adler glanced at the prosecution table. Pruitt looked irritated but composed. She knew what was happening. Vance was pulling the ground out from under her argument. Bit by bit, the worst part was the jury was responding. She needed to change the tone of the trial. Before it was too late, she stood. Your Honor, the prosecution request that Mr. Vance be sanctioned for improper courtroom conduct. He has repeatedly deflected, manipulated questioning, and turned this trial into a referendum on lawmaking, rather than a case about corporate wrongdoing. Allah turned back to Vance. Mr. Vance, do you have a response? John gave a small shrug. Your Honor, I have done nothing more than what the law allows me to do: present a defense. If the prosecution is unhappy that their case is being challenged, I'm afraid that's not my problem. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Adler felt the heat of their attention. Pressing down on him, he tapped his gavel once. Enough. His voice was sharper than intended. But he didn't correct it. This court does not exist for attorneys to play word games. He looked directly at John. I am issuing a fine of $10,008 for procedural misconduct. A hush fell over the room. John didn't react. No anger, no indignation. He simply nodded once as if he had expected it. But the silence in the courtroom wasn't from shock at the fine. It was from something else. A strange shift in the atmosphere. An unspoken question lingering in the air. Linda Pruitt frowned. Something was wrong. Judge Adler cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, do you have anything else to say before we proceed? John leaned forward slightly. His voice calm but unmistakably firm. I'd like to clarify something. Your Honor. He paused. Just long enough for the courtroom to hang on. His words, I am not just Mr. Vance. Adler blinked. Excuse me. John reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small folder. He handed it to the court clerk, who quickly walked it over to the judge's bench. Adler flipped it open, and then his expression changed. The room seemed to hold its breath. John Vance, no, JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, stood calmly before the court, hands folded in front of him. A collective wave of realization swept through the courtroom. The jury, the reporters, even Linda Pruitt looked momentarily frozen. Judge Adler's grip on the folder tightened. What is this? His voice was quieter now. John. JD spoke evenly. That is official documentation, verifying my identity and my temporary reinstatement as a practicing attorney, fully within my legal rights to argue this case. Adler flipped through the pages, each one confirming what his mind was struggling to process. The man he had just fined. Without realizing, it was the sitting Vice President of the United States. For the first time in the entire trial, John smiled. Judge Adler felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure who was actually in control of his own courtroom. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating. The weight of the revelation settled on everyone like a slow-moving storm. Reporters clutched their notebooks. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. And even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Judge Adler's face remained unreadable, but a tightness had formed around his mouth. His mind raced through the implications. He had just fined the sitting Vice President of the United States for procedural misconduct. He should have seen it: the way Vance carried himself, the way he spoke with a level of authority that went beyond just legal expertise. But no one had expected this. Linda Pruitt, to her credit, recovered quickly. Your Honor, she said, voice steady but laced with tension. This revelation doesn't change the facts of the case. We are still dealing with corpus misconduct. And whether or not Mr. Vance. Excuse me. Vice President Vance is representing the defense. Does not alter the charges against Titan Digital. She was right, but the shift in the room was undeniable. This wasn't just another trial anymore. Judge Adler closed the folder in front of him, exhaling sharply through his nose. He didn't like surprises, and this one had just flipped the entire case on its head. He turned to Vance. Mr. Vance. He stopped himself, correcting his words. Vice President Vance. I don't appreciate being blindsided in my own courtroom. If you had disclosed your identity at the start of this trial, we wouldn't be in this situation. John JD simply tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. Your Honor, I disclosed everything that was legally required. Nowhere in the law does it state that I must introduce myself with my political title. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. He wasn't wrong. Adler's fingers tapped against the bench. I have already issued a fine against you for procedural misconduct. Given this new information, are you contesting it? Vance let a small, almost amused smile cross his face. No, Your Honor. I'll pay it. Another murmur. This time louder. The Vice President of the United States just accepted a fine. An open court. Without hesitation, Linda Pruitt narrowed her eyes. She wasn't going to let this throw her off track. Mr. Vance, she caught herself. Vice President Vance, I have to ask. Why are you even here? You are the second most powerful person in the country. What possible reason could you have for taking on this case? The question was direct. The room waited for his answer. Vance exhaled slowly, then walked toward the jury box. He didn't look at Linda, he looked at them. When I took this case, I didn't do it because Titan Digital paid me. I didn't do it because I owed anyone a favor. He let the word sink in. I did it because this trial isn't just about one company. It's about the laws we choose to enforce and the ones we don't. The jury sat perfectly still. Linda Pruitt is a brilliant prosecutor. He continued, glancing at her. She's right about one thing. Titan Digital has operated in a morally gray area. But let's be honest with ourselves. If we convict them today, what are we really saying? That companies should be punished for following the law as it currently exists. Or are we just looking for a scapegoat because we refuse to update those laws? A few members of the jury swallowed hard. Titan Digital didn't break the law. They used it, and that's what this case is really about. Linda Pruitt's jaw clenched. You're suggesting that because the law isn't strict enough, there should be no accountability? Vance turned to her. Now I'm suggesting that if we don't like the laws, we should change them instead of punishing people who followed them. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Adler rubbed his temple, exhaustion creeping into his features. He had lost control of this trial, and he knew it. But the verdict hadn't been decided yet. Judge Adler let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting between the prosecution and the defense. The weight of this case had taken a different shape. What started as a corporate litigation trial had evolved into a public referendum on the limits of the law itself. The jury had been watching every word, every movement, absorbing the subtle war of ideology playing out in front of them. He turned to Linda Pruitt first. Ms. Pruitt, do you have any final statements before I dismiss the jury for deliberation? She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. Your Honor, the prosecution has laid out a clear case. Titan Digital knowingly exploited legal loopholes to engage in unethical behavior, to manipulate the market, to infringe on consumer rights. Vice President Vance may argue that the law is flawed, but that does not erase the damage done by Titan's actions. If corporations are allowed to operate without accountability, then what is the purpose of this court? A future is nodded faintly. Linda turned to them. Her voice measured if we send the message. That playing within the gray areas is acceptable. Then companies will never stop pushing those boundaries. At what point do we say enough? She sat down, her expression unreadable. But there was something behind her eyes. An understanding. That the case had not gone as planned. Judge Adler turned to Vance. Vice President Vance, your final remarks. Vance stood slowly, taking a moment before speaking. Your Honor, members of the jury. I won't deny that Titan Digital's practices are questionable. I won't deny that people were affected. The room was silent, but what I will deny, what I must deny, is the idea that this court is the place to fix what Congress has refused to fix. He let his words settle. The law is not a weapon to punish those we dislike. It is a framework, and if that framework is weak, it is not the duty of this court to bend it into something it was never meant to be. A single juror shifted in their seat. The impact of his words was real. But was it enough? Vance turned slightly, letting his gaze move across the jury box. You're not just deciding this case today. You're deciding how far the government can stretch the definition of wrongdoing. If we convict Titan Digital for actions that were not illegal, then what stops the next case from being built on outrage? Instead of law, another long pause. Then quietly, this isn't about what Titan Digital did. This is about what we are willing to do. In response, Judge Adler tapped his gavel lightly. The jury is dismissed for deliberation. A collective breath was released as the 12 jurors stood, exiting the courtroom in silence. The entire room remained still, waiting. Cameras from media outlets followed every movement. As people whispered among themselves. The wait felt endless. 30 minutes. An hour, then 2 hours later. The jury returned. Judge Adler nodded toward the foreperson. As the jury reached a verdict, a woman in her mid-40s stood. Her face impassive. We have, Your Honor. She unfolded a small piece of paper and read aloud. On the charge of corporate misconduct and unlawful data collection, we find Titan Digital not guilty. A wave of reactions rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped, others shook their heads. 1 or 2 members of the press bolted out the door, eager to be the first to report the verdict. Linda Pruitt kept her expression neutral, but the famous trace of disappointment flickered across her face. The jury had listened to the law, not their emotions. Vance, still standing, remained unreadable. He simply nodded once, as if he had known all along how this would end. Judge Adler tapped his gavel. This court is adjourned. The room erupted into movement. Voices rising, questions being thrown in every direction. Vance gathered his papers, taking his time as he turned to leave. Linda Pruitt called out, her voice quieter than before. You knew you were going to win, didn't you, Vance? Stopped but didn't turn. I knew the law was on my side. She shook her head, half in frustration, half in reluctant admiration. You didn't take this case to defend Titan Digital. You took it to prove a point. Now he turned, and did I? She studied him for a long moment before answering. I think you proved more than one. He gave a small nod before walking out the door. Cameras flashed, voices shouted. But JD Vance walked past it all, disappearing into the city. The courtroom would empty. The media would analyze every second of the case. But the real question would linger long after. Had justice been served, or had the law simply done what it was always designed to do? What do you think? Should companies be punished for unethical actions, even if they aren't illegal? Should the law be changed? Or is it up to businesses to operate with integrity? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think.